This is Strides to Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Esther Adams. Think about the last time you tried to learn something genuinely hard and it did not go well. Maybe it was a language or a new piece of software or trying to understand a concept in a class that made you feel, briefly, like the material was written in a code you had lost the key to. Now think about a different memory, a different kind of hard. A moment where you were struggling with something, actively confused, maybe a little frustrated, and it turned out that struggle was exactly the thing that made the idea finally click. Same word, struggle, describing two experiences that could not feel more different from each other. One left you defeated, the other left you smarter. And I think most of us have simply accepted this as unpredictable, as though some struggles are lucky and others are not. What the research actually suggests is that this is not luck at all. There is a real, identifiable boundary between the kind of difficulty that builds understanding and the kind that just breaks a person down. And today I want to walk through where that boundary sits and what determines which side of it you end up on. Let's start with why struggle helps at all, because the instinctive assumption most people carry is something close to a fitness metaphor. Effort equals growth. If it is not hard, it is not working. But that framing turns out to be only partly right, and the part it gets right is more specific than people usually assume. Struggle appears to help primarily by acting as a diagnostic tool. When you attempt to retrieve information from memory rather than simply rereading it, something researchers call effortful retrieval, the discomfort you feel is not incidental, it is doing real work. That discomfort exposes precisely what you do not yet know, in a way that passive review simply cannot. Rereading a chapter feels smooth because you already recognize the words. You are gliding across material you have seen before, and that gliding sensation gets misread as understanding. Testing yourself on the same material interrupts that glide. It forces you to actually locate the information inside your own memory, and when you cannot find it, that failure is informative. It tells you exactly where the gap is. This distinction matters more than it might sound like at first, because it reframes what struggle is actually doing at a mechanistic level. Some researchers have found that when learners struggle through effortful feedback on a difficult task, what improves is not necessarily their underlying sensitivity to the material, meaning their raw perceptual or conceptual accuracy. What improves is their calibration, their ability to accurately judge how well they actually know something. Struggle, in other words, often works less like a muscle building session and more like a mirror. It does not automatically make you stronger. It shows you, with more honesty than passive study ever will, exactly where you stand. And that honest information is what allows you to redirect your effort toward the place it is actually needed, rather than continuing to polish material you had already mastered 3 sessions ago. If struggle is this useful, why do people avoid it so reliably? This is where the research gets genuinely interesting, because it turns out the avoidance is not simply laziness. It is a specific, well-documented cognitive bias. Learners tend to judge how well they have learned something by how easily that something processes in the moment. Researchers call this an ease of processing heuristic, and it is a strikingly persuasive illusion. If material feels fluent, if it flows smoothly, we read that fluency as a sign of mastery. If material feels effortful, we read that effort as a sign of failure, even when the opposite is often true. This is precisely why a study method like interleaving, mixing different types of problems together rather than practicing one type repeatedly in a block, tends to get rejected by learners despite outperforming blocked practice on nearly every meaningful measure of retention. Interleaving feels harder in the moment. Blocked practice feels fluent, familiar, and therefore falsely reassuring. Learners are not choosing the worst method because they are careless. They are choosing it because their own moment to moment sense of how well things are going is quietly lying to them. There is neural evidence backing this up as well. When people form judgments about how well they have learned something, That process appears to unfold in at least two stages: an initial stage that retrieves cues related to fluency, followed by a second stage where those cues get used to form an actual confidence judgment. Because familiarity directly shapes those early fluency cues, the entire judgment can get hijacked by superficial ease before any real assessment of understanding has occurred. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it means the sensation of things going well during study is not a neutral, trustworthy signal. It is generated in part by the same mechanism that makes déjà vu feel oddly convincing. Fluency and truth are not the same thing, but the brain, left unchecked, tends to treat them as though they are. So we have two forces pulling against each other. Struggle exposes what you actually know, which is valuable, but struggle also feels bad, and that bad feeling gets misinterpreted as evidence the struggle itself is unproductive. Given that tension, what actually separates struggle that builds understanding from struggle that simply overwhelms someone? The clearest answer researchers have converged on involves working memory capacity, the limited mental workspace you use to hold and manipulate information while you are actively thinking. There is a well established relationship between task difficulty and how well a person can regulate their own learning. And it does not move in a straight line. It follows something closer to an inverted U shape. When a task is too easy, there is nothing to regulate. Your mind is not working hard enough to require any active monitoring or adjustment. When a task is moderately difficult, self regulation gets engaged productively. You are working hard enough to need to monitor your own understanding, adjust your approach, and notice when something is not landing. But when a task becomes too difficult, something worse than mere difficulty happens. The very act of self regulating, of monitoring your own comprehension and deciding how to respond to it itself consumes working memory resources. And when the task has already consumed most of that capacity, there is nothing left over to run the monitoring process at all. Self regulation does not just become harder in this zone, it collapses because the system trying to do the regulating has run out of the raw material it needs to function. This gives us a genuinely useful way to think about the difference between desirable difficulty and outright overload. Desirable difficulty is a small, deliberate increase in cognitive demand, enough to force deeper processing without filling up working memory to the point where regulation breaks down. Reading in a slightly harder to read font, for instance, has in some studies been shown to slow readers down just enough to increase attentive processing without overwhelming them. But this only works within a narrow range, and only when the added difficulty is aligned with what the learner is actually trying to achieve. Add too much friction, or add friction that has nothing to do with the learning goal itself, poor formatting, distracting design, an interface that is simply hard to navigate for reasons unrelated to the material, and you are not creating desirable difficulty anymore. You are creating what researchers call extraneous load, cognitive weight that competes for the same limited resources as the actual learning without contributing anything useful in return. And because different sources of cognitive load appear to be additive, stacking on top of each other, rather than existing in separate compartments, extraneous load and genuine task complexity draw from the exact same pool. There is no way to load up on unnecessary friction and expect the material itself to still get the attention it needs. This is why the same task can be a perfect challenge for one learner and a source of total shutdown for another. Working memory capacity, prior knowledge, and baseline stress levels are not evenly distributed. Someone who already has a strong foundation in a subject has more working memory available to devote to the new harder layer being added on top because less of their capacity is being spent simply decoding the basics. Someone without that foundation may hit overload at a difficulty level that another learner would find comfortably challenging. There is also research suggesting that a person's attachment style, their general pattern of relating to stress and to their own competence, can shift where this boundary sits. People with more anxious or avoidant patterns of relating to difficulty have shown heightened cognitive strain specifically under harder conditions, suggesting that emotional regulation and cognitive regulation are more entangled here than we tend to assume. The boundary between productive struggle and overload, in other words, is not a fixed property of the task. It moves depending on who is doing the struggling. This brings us to something I think deserves real emphasis because it complicates the popular idea that productive struggle is purely a cognitive phenomenon, something you can engineer with the right level of task difficulty alone. Struggle also has a motivational dimension, and getting that dimension wrong can turn an otherwise well calibrated challenge into something that simply breaks a learner's engagement. Researchers describe this in terms of basic psychological needs, specifically the need to feel autonomous, competent, and connected to others while working through something hard. When those needs are supported, when a learner feels they have some genuine choice in how they approach a task, feels a realistic sense that competence is achievable, and feels some degree of social support rather than total isolation, struggle tends to sustain engagement even when it is genuinely difficult. When those needs are thwarted instead, when a learner feels controlled, incompetent, and alone in the difficulty, the same objective level of task difficulty produces a very different subjective experience. Competence frustration specifically, that particular flavor of self doubt and felt failure, has been shown to predict heightened stress and to directly impair cognitive processing. This means two learners can be handed the identical difficult problem, and one experiences it as an engaging challenge, while the other experiences it as a confirmation that they simply cannot do this. And that difference is not primarily about intelligence. It is substantially about whether the surrounding conditions supported or undermined their basic psychological needs while they worked. There is a related design principle here worth mentioning because it shows how deliberately this boundary can be engineered rather than left to chance. Some instructional approaches intentionally have learners attempt to solve a problem before they receive any formal instruction on how to solve it, allowing them to fail in a structured, contained way first. This might sound counterproductive, deliberately setting someone up to fail, but the underlying logic is that this early, unsuccessful attempt activates and differentiates whatever prior knowledge the learner already has, surfacing exactly which pieces are missing so that the instruction which follows lands on genuinely prepared ground rather than being received passively. This approach has shown a real, moderate advantage over simply teaching the correct method first and having students practice it afterward, though the advantage depends heavily on how faithfully the approach is implemented, and it tends to work less well for younger learners and for very foundational domain general skills, where some baseline instruction up front still seems to matter more. I want to bring this back to something more personal before we close because I think the research here has a genuinely practical implication, and it is not simply push harder. If you find yourself in the middle of something difficult and it feels bad, that feeling alone does not tell you whether you are in productive territory or in overload. The more useful question is whether you can still feel yourself thinking, still feel some capacity to notice what you understand and what you do not, or whether your mind has gone somewhere closer to blank, grasping, unable to even locate the shape of the confusion. The first state is usually still productive, even though it is uncomfortable. The second is usually a sign that the difficulty has outpaced your available resources, in which case adding more effort will not help because the system doing the regulating has already run out of room to work with. In that state, the useful move is not to push harder. It is to reduce the load somehow, simplify the material, take a break to free up working memory, or seek out some support that removes the sense of isolation, rather than treating exhaustion itself as evidence you simply need to try harder. What I find most valuable about this research is that it gives struggle back its complexity rather than letting it collapse into either of the two oversimplified stories we usually tell about it. It is not simply true that struggle is always good, that discomfort is inherently virtuous, and that easier always means worse. And it is not simply true that struggle is something to be avoided, smoothed over, minimized in the name of comfort. The real picture is more precise than either story. Struggle helps when it stays within the range your working memory can actually support, when it is aligned with what you are genuinely trying to learn rather than incidental friction, and when the surrounding conditions give you enough autonomy, enough realistic sense of competence, and enough support to stay engaged with the difficulty instead of collapsing under it. Get that combination right, and struggle becomes one of the most reliable tools available for real understanding. Get it wrong, and the exact same discomfort produces nothing but exhaustion and a quiet, mistaken conclusion that you were simply not capable of the thing you were trying to learn. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.